Alright guys, welcome into Formula 1 news. Big drama ahead of the Miami Grand Prix with Fernando Alonso intending to take his complaints to the very top, to FIA President Mohammed Ben Sulayem over what he believes is very unfair stewarding decisions. Alonso is convinced that if he was in Hamilton's position turn 1 lap 1 yesterday, he would have been punished severely. He reckons that there was severe bias from the stewards against Spanish drivers. Does Alonso have a point? Very much interested your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I would greatly appreciate it. Lots to dive into today, and we've got to dive straight into, of course, this incident from yesterday's sprint race. Then we'll talk about qualifying. Then we'll talk about some other drama from around the paddock. Hamilton on the radio said the following: there was a gap on the inside, so I went for it. So this was that incident here, turn 1 lap 1. We can see Verstappen gets through turn 1 relatively cleanly. Ricciardo goes up to P3 because Perez was he locks up into the first corner, goes off the track a bit, gets back on, holds on to P4. Then of course the safety car deployed for what happens further back. So this is Lance Stroll tagging Lando Norris, who then spins around and is out of the Grand Prix, out of the sprint race. Okay, technically not a Grand Prix. Now, this was, of course, caused by this moment here. So let's have a look at this in detail. There's been lots of debate, really, on exactly who was at fault for this and whether there should have been anything to it. So here we go into turn 1. Just to see here, we've got Sergio Perez. He locks up, goes deep. So that's what happened at the front of the field. But the important thing is what happens further back, right? So Hamilton comes from a long way back. He's got a clean run up the inside. There's loads of room there. And he thinks, you know what? Why not? I'll just send it down the inside. So Hamilton sends it down the inside. This is Lando Norris on the outside. This is Lance Stroll. Lance Stroll turns in here quite aggressively. There is more room for Lance Stroll to use. He knows Alonso's on his inside. He can't really know Stroll that Hamilton is also here, right? I think realistically Stroll can't be, aware that Hamilton's also here. Now, Hamilton is in control of his car. Like, I don't think this was a bowling thing with Bottas, right, Hungary a couple of years ago when he just had no control and he was just sliding through and took everyone out. Like, Hamilton did make the corner relatively easily. Like, Hamilton, now look, he was wide at the apex, but, he does. It's not like he was completely out of control. He didn't lock up or anything, but this was definitely an aggressive move. But Stroll wasn't aware that he was there, so Stroll turns in, and this is the moment where Alonso and Stroll make contact. Hamilton isn't actually even there yet, and Alonso and Stroll have touched already. But that's because Alonso can't turn in further because he knows that Hamilton's going to touch him. So Hamilton's presence does affect Alonso's decision not to be able to turn in. Therefore, he touches Stroll, and therefore they all go into one another right about here because it all kind of comes together. Hamilton comes in, they touch a bit, and then of course it pushes Stroll off balance, and that sends Lando Norris round. So, at the end of the day, you've got a screenshot like this where we've got 4 cars into one corner, and this just isn't going to go. Like, there's nothing really you're going to do. 4 cars in one corner at this point, there's going to be problems. You're not going to be able to go 4 wide. So if there was any driver more at fault for this than anybody else, I think it's Hamilton, right? Coming in deep like that. And, if he wasn't doing that, there probably would have been no issues. But there is a good argument to say, and this is what the stewards think, that it's turn 1, it's lap 1, the move was potentially on for Hamilton, and he wasn't wildly out of control. There's 4 cars that are 4 wide. It's a racing incident, right? And I think that's what the stewards felt. Turn 1, lap 1 incidents are always given a bit more leeway because it always is going to be quite chaotic in certain situations. And unless someone makes a particularly egregious mistake, then instances like this can and will potentially happen. I mean, look at this shot. Hamilton's on the inside. This is Alonso. That's Stroll. And this is Norris on the outside. Like, it is an absolute mess here. So the stewards very quickly came to the decision that this was fine and it was all fair game and, basically no further investigation. I thought they might look into it more. You could have justified a penalty for Hamilton, but I think you can probably also justify no further action. But Alonso, he's not happy with that development, right? And we'll see why in a second. The other big point of controversy on the stewarding decisions was, of course, around Kevin Magnussen. This guy was, to be fair to him, providing the entertainment of the sprint because nothing else happened, let's be honest. But Magnussen was basically defending like Verstappen Brazil 2021 every single corner, every single occasion. Like, he was doing it all to keep Hamilton behind. Absolutely forcing him off the track, diving it down the inside when he can't make the corner, like whatever it takes to keep Hamilton behind. Because at this point, Magnussen was a little bit behind Hülkenberg. Hülkenberg was in a position to get points, so his job was to just keep Hamilton behind at any cost. That's what he did. Even in this moment, he sent Hamilton wide and off the track, and then Yuki got the jump on him, and then Magnussen, I believe, even made the tactical decision to allow Yuki to go through or whatever it was, to then play a bit of DRS dressed chicken and all of these games. But Magnussen, he was doing what is, well, shall we say, unsportsmanlike, but he is doing what he is allowed to do within the rules. Now, we saw a similar thing happen back in Jeddah when he was deliberately slowing up the pack the entire time to help his teammate out front, and that was considered unsportsmanlike and was given a penalty as a result. But, he was summoned to the stewards over this unsportsmanlike behaviour, and they couldn't really do anything about it. I think the issue at times with this comes down to, as Andrea Stella says, on the nature of the penalties, because once he got a 10-second penalty, his race is over at that point. So at that point, if you're Magnussen, does it matter if I have 10 seconds or 200 seconds? It doesn't matter, because I'm not getting the points anyway in the sprint, and if I can help out my teammate by making sure I keep Hamilton behind me, then I'm going to do exactly that. So Andrea Stella says, this is intentional damaging of another competitor, which it was. Like, that was not fair racing. Magnussen admits it wasn't fair racing, but he was doing what he was told to do by Haas, and he was doing what he knew he could get away with within the rules. So Andrea Stella says that maybe instead of 5 seconds, 5 seconds, 5 seconds, it should be exponentially increasing punishments. So if you go again and again and again on a penalty, maybe you should be forced to spend a weekend at home with your family reflecting on your sportsmanship and then go back in. He reckons it's entirely unacceptable. And I kind of agree. Like, I don't think that there should be any world in which that type of activity is actually incentivized. Like, it is incentivized for Magnussen to race in that way, because why would he not? There is literally no reason why he wouldn't. And that's what Magnussen says. I don't like it, but, these are the rules. That's what I'm going to do. As Magnussen said, all the penalties were well-deserved. No doubt about it. But I had to play the game. He had DRS from Nico, and then Nico cut the chicane and lost DRS, so therefore, he had to play the game there. And says, I had to create the gap like I did in Jeddah, using these stupid tactics. Like, he even refers to it himself, that what I did was stupid tactics, but it's like, it works. I don't like doing it, but at the end of the day, I did my job as a team player. Nico scored his points because I got the gap. It's not the way that I like to go racing at all. So, I think it was very honest here for Magnussen, and Hamilton was asked about this. It's funny, really, because I think people expected Hamilton to be like, oh my god, I can't believe this guy did that, cost me a point and all this stuff. Hamilton himself actually sped in the pit lane and got a 20-second penalty for it as a result. He actually got a drive-through for it. I think if it's under 5 kph over the limit, then you get a 5-second penalty. But if it's over 5 kph, because I think Hamilton didn't put his limiter on or whatever, and he was 10 kph over the limit in the pit lane under the safety car, so he got a full 20-second penalty, so he wasn't getting points anyway, right? But I think people expected Hamilton to be annoyed, and he basically was just laughing. He was like, yeah, well, fair play. We had a fun race at least. Hamilton certainly has recognised that, this car ain't great. What's the point being down in the dumps about it like he was back in 2022 when he felt like that was the year to get the 8th and the car was bad? This year, Hamilton's just vibing. He doesn't even seem to really care what happens in these moments, and maybe that's why he sent it down the inside of turn 1. But he said, fair play to Kev for actually admitting that. Maybe things need to change there, because we've seen this now a couple of times already where the rules don't really seem to align properly with what we want to see. But Max Verstappen won the sprint from Charles Leclerc. Max Verstappen won the sprint from Charles Leclerc. Perez got back up into third over Ricciardo. Ricciardo did a stellar job, by the way, defending from everybody behind him and secured a 4th place finish. Yuki ended up P8, of course, because Hamilton got that penalty. So, crazy scenes. Now, before we get into qualifying, let's talk about this major Alonso-related controversy, because, of course, he was not happy with this incident, and can totally understand exactly why, especially in light of what's been happening over the last couple of weeks, because Lando Norris was fined €50,000 for crossing the track without permission. We saw this back at Qatar last year. Hamilton was fined €50,000 for doing the same thing. So that seems to be probably fair enough. But the big debate really from Alonso was, and he was deeply frustrated with what happened back in China during the sprint race there, when he pushed Carlos Sainz wise. His feeling was it was fair racing, but he got handed a pretty big penalty for doing exactly that. Then afterwards, Aston Martin kind of appeals this, and the steward said, well, you have given us some new evidence, but we don't think it's significant, so we're going to throw out the case, basically. So that didn't go anywhere. But just there's been a feeling from Alonso that over the last, couple of months, even maybe several years, that he has been treated more harshly by the stewards than he might otherwise expect. So this is what Alonso then said after the race. And, I don't really agree with what he says here, but I just think that it's very interesting. So he comments on the Hamilton incident and says, I'm sure they won't do anything about it because he is not Spanish. So the implication implication from Alonso is that nationality plays a part in the decision-making of the stewards. We shall see what they decide. I imagine they won't decide anything because he isn't Spanish, but I think he ruined a lot of people's races, especially Norris, who had a very fast car. So are the stewards biased for and against certain drivers? I think there definitely is the argument that you can see it that way. There are certain decisions that have been made over the last few years that are difficult to explain if you don't consider that to at least be a possibility. I think the big one that people were talking about in recent times really was, the Verstappen incident in Singapore, not penalised for stopping in the pit lane, and even afterwards the stewards admitted, yeah, we really should have penalised that, not sure what we were doing, to be honest. So it was confusing, and there's been lots of talk about this over the last few years from various angles on, is there certain drivers that the stewards like, certain drivers the stewards dislike, certain drivers they'll give penalties to. Also, it's got to be said that on different weekends there are different stewards. So, there's usually like 4 stewards on a weekend that really make the decisions, and they vary somewhat. There's a head steward usually, but, over the course of the Grand Prix weekends, there are different stewards, and some maybe have worked with certain teams or drivers before, and maybe they have more bias towards certain teams and drivers than others do. And I think that probably is a thing. Difficult to say to who, or to what extent, or which potential stewards, right? But it's always been a talking point that goes around on stewards being more biased to some drivers and less biased towards others. And that's worthy of conversation. But I think Alonso's perspective kind of takes it one step further, right? Because he's not just saying they're biased against myself because I'm Alonso and they don't like me. He's saying they're biased against me because I'm Spanish, which is actually another accusation entirely, and takes it one step further, right, in terms of potential implications on this one. So Alonso actually says, I do feel that nationality matters, and I will speak with Mohammed. So, of course, Ben Sulayem, with the FIA, whatever. So his intention is to take his feelings to the top. What happened in China, what's now happened here, he feels like Hamilton, didn't get punished because he's British, I guess is the implication or whatever, right? And then Alonso, if he was in Hamilton's shoes, would have been punished, he believes, for that incident. I need to make sure there isn't anything wrong with my nationality or anything that can influence any decision, not only for me, also for the future generation of Spanish drivers. They need to be protected. So, look, I'm not Spanish. I'm not really in a position to comment on what Alonso seems as a historic discrimination against Spanish drivers that continues to this day. Does he have a point that maybe another driver in Hamilton's shoes there would have been penalised? Possibly. It's difficult to say, isn't it? Because every instance at every Grand Prix is always slightly different, so it's tough to say. Do I personally think the nationality has anything to do with it? No. But, is Alonso in a better position to comment than I? Probably yes. And that's what he says. Like, Hamilton was coming from the inside without control of the car. If I do that, for sure that I get a penalty. So, very interesting stuff. Now, one thing I do agree with Alonso is on sprint races. In sprints, he says, you can only damage the car or get penalties. We confirm again, there wasn't much action in the sprint. Hopefully next time we don't even start the sprint. And, of course, the other point is a smooth operator here, 55 Sainz Carlos mentions in the replies. The sprint races are basically a spoiler, which has always been true. The benefit this year, in some degree, is that you can change the setup from the sprints to the main Grand Prix. So if a car is not performing as they expected, you can change that around for the main race. The issue is with that is that Red Bull usually get it right, and after the sprint, they're therefore allowed to make more changes to get it even more right. And basically Red Bull said this, that in the sprint yesterday, they weren't really that good. I mean, they were faster than Leclerc, but it's not like Max completely drove off into the distance. They were struggling a little bit, even Max was, with these strange conditions in Miami. But then Red Bull said, yep, we made some setup adjustments for qualifying, and now we think our car's in a much better spot, and probably Max wins the race by a mile today. So it's like, even when the sprint race opens the door to potentially some setup related anguish, because Parc Ferme now reopens, it does make things better because teams can make their adjustments and therefore the race might not be the same as the sprints. But Red Bull are still going to win, which I think is the point at the end of the day. This was fascinating though. Miami qualifying yesterday was really strange. The track conditions were very confusing. The drivers, the teams couldn't figure out the tyres to get them in the right window, like basically at all. And if every team is struggling with this, it says to me more about the track and more about the Pirelli rubber, that I've never been a big fan of, to be honest, than I think it does about the teams. But Alonso's qualifying last year was a 1:27.2. This year, his qualifying was a 1:28.4. So it was crazy to see the difference in the track conditions. And this was the main qualifying session here. This is Q1. Verstappen with a 1:27.7. Bottas was out. Ricciardo was a big scalp here, right? Because he's just got top 4 in the sprint, had a phenomenal race, and then couldn't find the time. He made a couple of mistakes on his final run. It was marginal, but yeah, Ricciardo from the absolute hero of the day to the zero of the day, right back to the back of the grid, because he's got that 3-place penalty drop as well for the safety car infringement or whatever it was back in China. So he will be starting last place here in the Grand Prix tomorrow. This was what happened in Q2. It was interesting though, because Verstappen, it looked like in Q2 we had a fight for pole. Leclerc was right up there, Verstappen was there, Piastri was there, right, of course, in that McLaren. Perez was in the conversation, like Sainz wasn't too far away, and then Hamilton puts in a good lap to go second. Like, this is why the Mercedes is so confusing. Like, they don't even understand what's going on here. Like, Hamilton put in a very solid lap, a 1:27.7, you know, 10th and a half off Leclerc. Into P2 was looking like, wow, okay, the Mercedes might be here. I mean, it's literally 10 minutes time. We're going to do our final runs in Q3, all these different teams. And yet the Mercedes in 1 minute is looking rather competitive, and then the next minute is completely disappearing. So obviously Q3 happens. Alonso out and Stroll out, though, was one of the big talking points here, because, yeah, in the end, like, Alonso obviously talked a lot during the day on various problems, but like they made some setup changes, it seems, Aston, and it didn't work for them. They dropped backwards through the grid, and Alonso was, yeah, out-qualified by Stroll. You don't see that too many times, especially, you know, I think twice in the same day. Well, I think it happened in the sprint, of course, as well. Verstappen, though, sticks it on pole again, and I don't know when his pole streak is going to come to an end. He's got the best car. This year, the Ferrari don't have the qualifying monster they had last year, even though Leclerc did very well to get close here. But yeah, he joined a very exclusive list of drivers that have secured 7 poles in a row. Ayrton Senna, Alain Prost, Michael Schumacher, Lewis Hamilton, and now, of course, Max Verstappen. So I don't know when this streak is going to come to an end. Good lap from Max, but it was a weird qualifying because nobody improved. I think only Perez maybe marginally on his final run, which was quite anticlimactic. And in the end, the McLarens just weren't really that close. So yeah, I think this year's pole time was slower than last year's pole time, probably by quite some margin, actually, which shows these strange track conditions and temperatures. I think the teams generally were struggling keeping the tyres cool. Like, they were doing an outlap and the tyres were massively overheating and giving them no grip. So that was the real challenge for the drivers, and it just meant that it was all over the place, right? Hamilton went from doing a 27.6 on a set of softs in Q2 to then doing a 28.1 along with Russell on a set of mediums. Hamilton did this lap time on because I think Mercedes might have run out of new softs. It was an absolute mess for them. This is the grid, though. Ricciardo starting at the back, and you know, so Verstappen, Leclerc, Sainz. To be fair, Sainz getting P3 over Perez might be a big deal because it could mean that the Ferraris could play a strategic game to try and beat Max here tomorrow. Because it means the Ferraris could play a strategic game to try and beat Max, but that might prove to be a challenge because the car's probably going to be rather good. And just before we close out the video, some comment on Mercedes, right? Because Toto was not a happy man, understandably. I think even Russell said that they've made compromises with their car, but they've made too many compromises. Last year, the Mercedes struggled to get the tyres up to temperature. This year, it's overheating the tyres too much, and it may be rear suspension related. Apparently, Aston have a similar problem on their car as well. So it's likely that their suspension changes affected things here on not a particularly good level. I don't know how Toto expects to convince Newey to come, to convince Marco to come, to convince Max to come. And even he said this to Sky Germany on Adrian Newey: even the greatest magician would have difficulties in solving our problems, which is, I mean, it's a hilarious thing to say. He's not wrong on the situation, but he's basically like saying, yeah, Newey, you might not even want to come here, mate, because it's not looking good. And Newey apparently said this himself the other day as well. Just the final thing on Kimi Antonelli, because Mercedes are emphatically shutting down any rumours that they're going to put him in a car anytime soon, even though we think they have, or maybe Williams have probably, asked for an exemption to see if he can get in the car immediately. Toto's still saying no, that's not the case, and apparently they're going to compare both Antonelli and Mick Schumacher in a test at Silverstone next week in the W13 to see how they get on. Basically to benchmark Antonelli, because they kind of know what Schumacher's capable of. They're not putting him in the car, let's be honest, Mick. So Antonelli, if he smokes Mick, then he probably gets a drive at some point. But, you know, Toto says, yeah, there's no way that he's going to debut in Imola in 2 weekends' time for Williams, although sometimes rumours are denied until magically they then become true. But very much interested in your thoughts on all this stuff in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.